Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. It's my pleasure to be here to share with you my research findings. I'm currently a graduate student in the Department of Applied Foreign Languages at National University of Science and Technology. Today, the title of my research topic is the effects of word exposure frequency and the elaboration of word processing on incidental second language vocabulary acquisition through reading. This presentation will take maybe about 10 minutes because I have 3 people to do the presentation. So if we have the questions, maybe we can leave the questions at the end of the presentation. Okay, I have 6 parts in my presentation: introduction, literature review, method, results, discussion, and conclusions. The last one is limitation and future research. Okay, why did I choose this topic? Because the interest in vocabulary teaching and learning has a long history, which means many researchers have done such researches. So that I can have a large amount of data that I can use. And people argue intentional word learning based on focus on foreign vocabulary teaching is more efficient than incidental meaning-focused word learning. The presentation will focus on the 2 terms, incidental and the intentional learning. And background of the study. I just want to remind you that, just like what I said, the presentation will focus on incidental and intentional learning, because studies on word exposure frequently during extensive reading provide considerable evidence for the positive effects of word repetition. That means if readers read the articles, maybe he or she encounters the same words for several times, that he or she can learn the word incidentally. And the sentence at the bottom of the slide is that there are 3 factors related to successful second language vocabulary acquisition through reading. Okay. And just like what I said, word exposure frequency and elaboration of word processing play an important role in my presentation. So I want to clarify the 2 terms to you at first. Word exposure frequency, to make it easier to understand, that means readers read the same word maybe for 5 times or 1 time. That's different frequency of the word. And the second one is elaboration of word processing. Of course, and also to make it easier to understand, if a learner encounters a new word, he or she use the word to perform the task. For example, he or she can write the composition, including the words into his or her composition. Okay, so the purpose of my study is quite very easy to know, because the 2 terms, frequency and elaboration, are separate. So I want to combine the 2 terms, the 2 tactics into the study, so that I can know the 2 variables and what do they bring the influence to the English learners. Okay, these are my research questions. Okay, just like what I said, the significance of the study is that tasks included systematically manipulate the first independent variable, exposure frequency, and the second variable, elaboration of word processing. Okay, let's do a quick literature review. Early research on second language vocabulary acquisition has shown that incidental learning of word meaning and form through reading occurs. And the next one is, however, found that Owari and Takaki found that even after learners encounter of words 15 times word knowledge diminished drastically within 3 months. So even though readers or learners encounter the same word for 15 times, if he or she didn't use it, he lose it, he or she lose it. Okay, so this next one is the elaboration of word processing. In this part, I want to focus on how researcher can do to help the English learners to retain the word via elaboration of word processing. There are 4 kinds of knowledge of vocabulary: passive, receptive, or active productive knowledge, or a word is recalled or recognized by a learner. Okay, the method I used the quantitative method. The results of tests were evaluated to present the relationship between the word exposure frequency and elaboration of word processing with numbers. So, in the latter presentation, I will use the figures and tables to show the results. And participants, I have 30 students, and course met 5 times a week each for 4 hours each time, and they were aged between 22 and 27. Okay, about the instruments, I have 3 kinds of instruments in my research. Task 1, filling in text gaps from a word listing, and Task 2, reading a text with marginal glosses. Task 3, writing a related composition. And tests, after every task, they will be given a test immediately. So of course they didn't know vocabulary tests were to be administered after the reading text. And all tests and tasks took place in participants' regular class. So it won't be a surprise for the respondents or the participants to receive the test. And the 3, all materials and the instructions were provided in English, of course. Just like what I said, we have an immediate test after every task, and I had a post-test for them to measure if they learn the word exactly. That's my materials: target words, reading text, and operationalization of exposure frequency and elaboration of word processing. I used two softwares to run the final results for the study. Okay, I want to put the results and discussions and conclusion together because I will use a lot of figures to let you understand it clearly. Okay, about question 1, what are the effects of exposure frequency and task-induced involvement load on learners' overall initial word learning and medium-term word retention? Okay, so I think we can see the figure quite clearly. So later we will compare the 2 figures at the same time. Okay, so we can find a major point, which is task 3 had the better effect on vocabulary retention. What is the task 3 really about? Task 3, we need to ask the learners to go home to write a composition by using the word that he or she has learned during the text. And about the question 2, what are the effects of exposure frequency and task-induced involvement laid on learners' 4 types of word knowledge in initial word learning and in medium-term word retention? still I have two figures to answer this question. Okay, still. Task 3. And just like what I said, they were asked to write a composition, so which means they have to use the word they learned before. So and that makes sense. They have the better effect in medium-term word retention.
10 minutes.
And question 3: do word retention rates different for the 4 types of words not measured? Okay, we can see the figure clearly. All the 4 types of knowledge decreased drastically over time, just like the figure. Okay, about the limitation and future research, I have 2 major concerns for you to discuss. The first one is that because what I mentioned in my study, repeating major task, and tests. I think this process will make the participants know that they will receive the test after every test. So is that incidental or intentional? So it is a question for you to think. And then the second one is, are there 2 dichotomous learning models or orientations of learners? So is it easy for you to for us to identify the learners learn words incidentally or intentionally? I don't think it's quite easy to do that. Okay, according to the research. And the next one is incidental or intentional. I gave a suggestion for the future research, which the researchers in the future study can use the think aloud protocols. It's a kind of sort of research method concerning about qualitative research. I think by doing so, research can have the ideas to know if the learners learn words incidentally or intentionally. Okay, thank you. That's my presentation.
So, Kat, would you mind if you start the question?
I'm curious. Only one thing I always think about. What's the connection with your future study or your future work? If you are going to be, or you are being a teacher, or you are going to be a future teacher in the future, and the thesis or the proposal or the topic, will it be connecting to your future work or not? Whether it will connect it or not.
Okay, thank you for the question. It's a good point. And let me try my best to answer you. Because you mentioned that if this thesis will be related to my future work, I've taught for 8 years. I've been struggling to teach students vocabulary, and thus I want to develop some maybe novel ways. Not novel or interesting ways to advise their interests. So I need to find how English learners learn words first, and then I can add something maybe fundamental to my maybe teaching ways in the future. So I think what I'm going to do is quite important to me in the future.
Well, that's very great because it's very clear. It's very clear on the topic. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Could you show me the first slide of the background of the study? Not this and next. I think there are one slide without the parentheses of researchers include, and I wonder are those words written by other scholars or by you?
On the background of the study, I summarized the ideas from many scholars. That's a major point.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
What is the most impressive thing you see in the study?
Okay, first, I think that's a good question. Because I combined the two process of word learning into my research, so I think what the researcher did is quite a model for me to follow. So in my study in the future, so I think I will use the same model to run some kind of test and for the students in junior high school, possible. Yeah.
Because you mentioned that you give your students the task and then a test, and test, and this is the sequential process that the students, when they take this kind of activity, do they feel panic and cannot reflect the real outcome that they learn?
If I were in the researcher's shoes, I would say no, because the learners were in the advanced level. They were expected to learn things. So does that answer your question? Thank you.
Since you use quantitative research method in your thesis, if you can redo your thesis again, will you apply quantitative research method or qualitative research method in your thesis?
That's a good question. Thank you for asking. I think I will use qualitative research instead of only using quantitative research, because I think what the research lack is that and the researcher cannot convince us how the learners really learn words incidentally or intentionally. In his or her paper, the ideas were quite vague. The ideas were shifting from incidental to intentionally all the time. So in my research, I will add the quantitative research to define if the learners learn words incidentally or intentionally. Thank you.
Okay, and then
As you mentioned, this is your model, right? So is there any improvement you want to change when you apply to your thesis? Like participants, so yeah.
I think there is one major challenge part I will encountered, and that is because the tests were for the advanced learners. All the students I teach, they were the beginning learners. So I think the challenge in the future for me will be how do I design the tests for the beginning learners. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Basically, I don't have any question, but I do have a suggestion. In the beginning, because after all, this is not your thesis, so I suggest that you put the author's name in the first page, not just your name, or I would thought that that's your thesis.
Okay,
That's all.
thank you.
And then please go to 1.1, background of the study. Next page. Yes, here, the second bullet point. You have 1, 2, 3, right? So this intends the second line of each sentence. For example, words, and then we reinforce. So the indentation is important here. 把它缩进去这样，像 words 那个地方要缩进去 ，reinforce 那个地方缩进去。 And then you throughout your presentation you repeated using the phrase like just like what I said, just like what I said. So I would suggest that you paraphrase this, as I mentioned earlier, something like that. And the second suggestion is about the timeliness of the literature review. For me, I wonder when the paper was published.
Do you know when the paper was published?
2012. But for me, the literature you reviewed are some way out of date. So please double check in your future study. You need to take into consideration the timeliness of the literature review. 这篇文章里面的文献探讨都蛮早的，所以 please pay particular attention to the timeliness of literature review section. And please go to 3.3. 有一个 list in test. Next page. 下一页。你有一行有一个 list in， 觉得那个文法怪怪的。这里 the first task, task 1, filling in task gaps from a word list in. I want to find the list of word in. Filling in task gaps from a word list. So in is not necessary. So please delete in at the end of this. And then task induced. 在这边最上面 3.3.1 3 task variable task induced. There is no space before the hyphen. 好 and then parentheses 下一页的 parentheses 再下一页好这边的那个 parentheses 里面不用 space 比如说 at the end of week 11前面不用空格好那下一行是 in week 14 there is no space here okay basically these are what I have to add in my notes okay thank you for your presentation